Hey everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about the power and importance of summarizing information, whether that's information that you've just read or that's information that someone's just conveyed to you in a conversation. So what are you doing when you're summarizing? I like to think of summarizing as a certain type of attention, or it's a mode through which you attend to some information and not others. Let me back up and let me tell a story, particularly when it comes to reading and the importance of summarizing what you read. So when I first started reading somewhat seriously, I want to say it was either 2017, 2018, and I was about to join the Marine Corps. I was an undergrad in college. I was a mechanical engineering major, and I was about to graduate and commission and start my basic training as a Marine Corps officer. And trying to set myself up for success and trying to understand the culture of being a Marine Corps officer, two of the things that I always heard were that a good officer is someone who reads a lot and is someone who runs a lot. So kind of already had that latter aspect down. And so I decided to try to develop a habit of reading. And so I pick up books. I really started with financial books, how to day trade and swing trade and real estate investment books. And that eventually shaded into more self-help books and more psychology and understanding risk and different, I would say, rudimentary texts on philosophy. But it all started with trying to be a day trader. And as I was reading, the habit was at first just to get through 20 pages a day, and then, that would turn into 30 pages and 40 pages, but really not too much more than that. And my goal was to get through the book. I would read all of the books as if they were stories. Most of them were nonfiction. And my goal, like I said, was just to get through the books. I noticed that as I was developing a practice of reading and I was talking to some of my friends, either from college or when I eventually got into the Marine Corps, talking to fellow officers and my peers, that kind of became a part of my identity. I was someone who read, and I was someone who read a lot. I could say things like, "Oh, I get through, 2 to 3 books a week," and I felt proud about that. So about a year into being a Marine Corps officer, I had read, a certain amount of books, and I thought I knew something, and I thought I could call myself a reader. And during one training session, there was this interesting conversation that I remember between two senior officers. So remember, my interpretation of being a Marine Corps officer is that you're someone who reads and you're someone who runs, you're someone who's fit. So these two officers, we had some downtime during the training, and they were discussing this book that came out. I believe it was Curious by Ian Leslie. And the first officer was asking the second officer to summarize the overview of the book, or to provide an overview of the book. And the second officer did so. And then the first officer asked a more specific question about something that the second officer said. And the second officer couldn't provide an answer. Now, why he couldn't provide an answer, who knows? But I remember feeling when I heard that exchange that that second officer kind of only had a cursory or surface level understanding of what he had just read. Now, what's funny is that I had also just read that book, and I couldn't answer the question either. And so it kind of hit home for me that, wow, what am I doing when I'm reading? Am I really understanding what I'm sifting through? Am I acquiring this information in a way that's actionable and is shifting how I see the world? Why am I reading? And the answer at that time was really, like I mentioned before, to just kind of get through the books and be able to say that I've read a lot. So I was doing a lot of surface level reading and not really doing a lot of understanding. And it wasn't until I started listening to Jordan Peterson where I learned about this technique of summarizing when you're reading. And I believe it was a Q&A video that he was hosting, and he was talking about how to remember what you read. And his advice was to read a few paragraphs, close the book, put it away, and then think about or state out loud or write about what you think you just read. And so summarize what you just read. And that is a very slow process. It's definitely very different from how I was reading. And this is also a technique that Cal Newport has discussed. Cal Newport wrote some great books, Deep Work, So Good They Can't Ignore You. I think that's the title of another book. And what's so interesting is that I can go to my bookshelf. I wish I could show you guys, but I'm not at my apartment right now. I can go to my bookshelf and I can pinpoint when I started using this technique, because I know the books that up until that point, I really don't remember what I read. I remember that maybe there's a few books prior to when I started using this technique where there were just some, really good like golden nuggets, like from How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. There's a few tidbits in there that I've been practicing and been trying to utilize in my life. So I remember a little bit more of those things, but most of the books, I would say there's a solid like 40 or 50 books that I might as well have not read them. And so on my bookshelf, when I started using this technique, now not only do I actually have notes and I have summarized versions of the books, and so when I'm out or I'm writing and I just have my laptop, I have access to all of that knowledge still, which is nice. But I can do a better job of actively recalling the information in those books, and that's just been so much more helpful. And it's forced me to slow down my reading, but also attend to what I think the author is saying. And part of what I think happens when I'm summarizing these texts is that there's so much information that we use to convey our point, and not all of that information is needed. So when I'm summarizing, what I'm trying to do is extract the gist. And so I might take a page and then compress that down into a paragraph, or I might take a paragraph and just compress that down into a sentence. And it doesn't mean that I'm right. It doesn't mean that I fully understand what the author is saying, but it does force me to wrestle with the concepts and ideas in a way that's different from just reading the words and reading the phrases and reading the paragraphs. It forces me to sit down, take a pause and think about, okay, what is the point? What am I supposed to understand from this page? And the thing about a good text, in my opinion, is that there is, if it's a coherent essay or book or chapter, it revolves around a singular point, and all of the concepts and explorations and maybe even the unnecessary tidbits of information are linked to that central point. And so if you can get at that central point, to me, that feels like a deeper understanding, rather than understanding kind of some of the more surface level or peripheral concepts that are being provided. Now, one thing I think about is, well, why don't people just communicate with the gist or with those essential tidbits of information only, instead of writing a whole chapter to say a singular point? Well, I think that good writers strive to do that. That's definitely something that I wrestle with. But I also think that from a technical standpoint, there are some points or central meanings of a text that require the author to explore through those less essential pieces of information. I got this from a concept. This concept, I got it from Norretranders. He wrote a book called The User Illusion, where he talks about the difference between information and exformation. So imagine that you're at the grocery store and you're about to check out. Let's say you bought a $3 apple, a $5 bag of rice, and a $10 bag of coffee. So one of the ways you can represent the information of the price of all of those items is by 3 plus 5 plus 10. You have that equation, right? That's a lot of information. That's a set of information, okay? Now, if you want to check out, you need to know the total price. So what you can do is you run the calculation by summing all of those prices together, and you get 18. And you get 18. Now, 18, like the digits in 18, the information in the sum of 18 is less than the information that's in the equation where you have all of the individual prices listed out. So the process of calculating the total led to the discarding of some information that you initially had, which was the individual prices, and now you have new information, which is the sum. And so Norretranders would say that the information that was discarded is called exformation. But here's how this relates back to why I think we can't just communicate with, let's say, the new information, the point, the meaning. In order for us to have gotten to 18 for our practical purposes of checking out and getting our items, we had to first know the prices of all of the items individually. So in many instances, there's just a requirement to work through and gather what will eventually be exformation first. Then you run the calculation. Then you have the new information that's essentially still the same thing, right? Even from a mathematical perspective, we're adding these three numbers together and we're getting the same number, but they're equal to each other, but they're just represented differently. And there's more information in the exformation, and there's less information in the new sum. I hope that made sense. The point that I'm trying to illustrate is that when you're reading a text, or even when you're listening to someone, and we can transfer to conversations, when you're listening to someone, oftentimes there's a requirement to explore and play with a lot of information before you can get at the central point or the central meaning of what is trying to be conveyed. So summarizing in reading has helped me remember, but also understand the information that I've been reading. And it's just been useful it's been useful on my journey in terms of studying and trying to understand these different texts that I'm reading. Okay, summarizing in conversations, very similar process and very similar benefits, in my opinion. Excuse me. When you're listening to someone, they're going to, perhaps as you're listening to me right now, there's a lot of tangents and there's a lot of filler words and expressions. There's so much information that's coming at you. But at the same time, I'm trying to convey a central point, right? I'm trying to convey the importance of summarizing. Part of how you can show that you have been paying attention to what the other person has been saying, and part of how you can show that you're actually listening to them and hearing them, is by re-summarizing or summarizing what they said to you in a manner that they deem as appropriate. So this is something, again, I got from Jordan Peterson, but through him reading Carl Rogers, and he has Dr. Rogers has a little 30 some odd page book that you can buy on Amazon. And I also think that there's a PDF version of him talking about and writing about active listening and how important it can be in relationships. And active listening, a big part of active listening is summarizing what the other person is saying and repeating it back to them. So as I mentioned, when you're listening to someone, they're going to be all over the place sometimes. Even if they're a coherent speaker, they might talk for 10 minutes. And what you can do, what most people do, and Dr. Rogers talked about this, what most people do is they think about what they're going to say next. They're not actually attending to the meaning behind what the person is saying. And even for people who are clear speakers, like I mentioned, there's a lot of information that they're conveying, not just in their words, but also in their facial expressions, in their tonality, in their rhythm, in their body language, in their body positioning, to you. And then that is all nested in a greater context of their past experience or their anticipations of the future. So there's just a lot of information that's being communicated to you. And if you can summarize and extract the gist from that aspect of the conversation and represent that to them, you're helping them understand themselves better, as well as communicating to them that you have heard them and that you were actually here in the conversation, attending to them and trying to be present. Like I said, what most people do, and I fall prey to this as well, most of the time what we're doing when we're trying to listen is we're thinking about what we're going to say next. Or, if it's a heated argument, let's say you're in an intimate relationship, you're thinking about how they're wrong? Are you thinking about how, because they're wrong, this relates to a trend of a deeper flaw in their character, and you just can't wait to tell them that? It's or if it's not an intimate relationship and you're having a political discussion or you're having an intellectual discussion, and still you're oriented at trying to win the conversation and just tell them how wrong you are, tell them how wrong they are. That's not listening. And oftentimes what happens is that when the other person is done speaking, we respond not to what they said, but to what we think they said. And that can lead to miscommunications and conflict. And it's not the most productive way to learn if that's your goal. So to focus on summarizing, to focus on attending to what the person is saying as far as the deeper meaning that they're trying to communicate, one of the things I think that does is that it helps shift your orientation. It helps shift your goal from trying to be right in the conversation to trying to learn and trying to be better and to trying to adapt. Another thing that I think it does, and this is something that Dr. Rogers spoke about, it conveys empathy. It conveys to the other person that you are actually listening to them. And that can be helpful because either in any conversation that gets heated, oftentimes the emotions can get in the way of the productivity of the conversation. And when you're displaying empathy for the other person, it can disarm them and it can reinforce in their mind the idea that you actually care about them and that you're actually trying to learn and that you're not someone who's just trying to put them down. One of the ways that people get emotional in a conversation is if they feel that they are not being heard. And so one of the ways that you can help let them know that you are hearing them is by summarizing back to them what they said. If they're speaking for 10 minutes, take 2 minutes to compress all of that information, discard the explanation, and just present them with the total, the information, the gist, the deeper meaning of what they said, and then ask them, is that what you mean? Did I hear you correctly? And if they say yes, then, at least they can't then say that you weren't listening, you weren't paying attention, because the evidence is there that you were obviously attending to them, and you weren't just thinking about your own thoughts, or you weren't just festering in your own feelings and emotions. So summarizing, the power of summarizing, I think it's extremely helpful. It's helped me in my reading. It's helped me in my conversations, in getting to know people, and it's helped me in my relationship. And so highly recommend that whenever you can, whenever you're reading, when you're in class, when you're trying to better understand any information that's being presented to you, try to summarize it. And, I think it'll be helpful, and I hope that it's something that as you practice it, you'll get better at, and you'll be able to help other people do it as well. So I think I'm going to end the video there. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.